Wake Island is an atoll located in the northwestern Pacific Ocean. Like many other small and previously obscure islands in the western Pacific, it suddenly held great importance at the outbreak of conflict between Japan and the United States in December 1941. The island is shaped somewhat like the letter V, with the three smaller islets of Peel, Wilkes, and Wake Islands surrounding a central lagoon. The U.S. Navy began to build a base on and send sailors to there in January 1941. By December, the island was defended with six 5-inch repurposed battleship guns, 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, around 50 machine guns, and 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter aircraft. There were 450 Marines, around 1,200 civilian contractors, and about 70 servicemen from the Army and Navy on the island at that time. The defenders of Wake Island first learned of the bombing of Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 8th, which was the same day as the attack, given that the island is west of the international date line and thus a day behind Hawaii. The Japanese strategy was to strike not only at Pearl Harbor, but also at U.S. military bases across the Pacific simultaneously, so the first raid on Wake Island came on the 8th. It's important to note that the island's defenders didn't have access to radar detection systems and couldn't hear incoming aircraft over the sound of the waves crashing along the island's beaches, so it was easy for enemy air raids to catch them by surprise. 36 Japanese bomber aircraft were able to strike a major blow by destroying 8 of the 12 American fighters. Raids followed on the next 2 days, destroying the island's hospital, with the defenders being able to inflict little damage on the attacking aircraft. The first of 2 major Japanese landing attempts took place on December 11th. The invasion force consisted of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, and additional supporting ships, along with 450 Special Naval Landing Force troops, essentially the Japanese version of U.S. Marines, for the amphibious assault. The attempt began at 5:22 a.m., when the ships started bombarding the island with their naval guns. The island's defenders allowed the ships to draw in closer and closer until they began firing their 5-inch coastal defense guns at 6:10. They hit the enemy flagship, Yubari, a few times and halted its shelling of the island. At 6:52, the defenders had an even greater success as they landed multiple hits on the destroyer Hayate, causing an explosion that rapidly sunk the ship. Additional hits on accompanying destroyers and transports, along with poor weather, caused the Japanese fleet to retreat. However, the defenders were not yet finished. The 4 remaining fighter aircraft on the island were able to take off, with each carrying 2 100-pound bombs. One of the fighters was able to hit the destroyer Kisaragi with at least 1 bomb. It later exploded and sunk at around 7:30 a.m. The Japanese continued to send bombing raids to Wake Island over the next 10 days. The defenders had lost a plane on December 11th, leaving them with only 3, but they still managed to put up a determined defense between the remaining planes and 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. However, the Japanese gained air superiority on December 21st and 22nd, with a total of 121 aircraft launched from both carriers and land bases against the island across those 2 days. All of the defenders' fighters were either heavily damaged or lost by the end of the 22nd. The Japanese brought a much larger force for their second landing attempt on December 23rd, including 2 aircraft carriers, 6 cruisers, 5 destroyers, and 1,500 landing troops. The assault began at around 2:30 a.m. when the Japanese launched 4 landing craft towards landing points on Wilkes and Wake Islands. The defenders were able to repel the assault on Wilkes effectively and suffered few casualties. Although a group of Marines was able to destroy 2 of the landing craft after they had already been beached using a 3-inch gun, the situation was more dire on Wake. Elements of the defensive forces became splintered and outflanked as the early morning hours progressed. The island's commander had lost communication with not only the defensive forces on Wilkes, but also those on the western side of Wake, and did not know that those units were holding their ground effectively. Instead, he saw that defensive lines on the center and eastern sides of Wake were continuing to weaken and believed that Wilkes had fallen to the enemy. American forces began surrendering at about 8 a.m., although isolated fighting continued throughout the morning, given that communication lines were down and it was difficult to spread news of the surrender. All told, by the end of the battle, the Japanese had lost 4 ships, a submarine, and around 1,000 soldiers, while only around 120 of the island's defenders had been killed. Most of the military and civilian prisoners of war were shipped out from the island in January 1942, with another small transport of them occurring in September of that year. American forces conducted occasional bombing raids against Wake Island over the next 4 years of the war, but never made a serious effort to recapture it, instead focusing their resources on other island chains. Despite the fact that the island was lost to the Japanese, the lasting memory of the battle was the ability of the defenders to hold out against overwhelming force, especially on December 11th when they were able to turn back the first landing attempt. It provided a major morale boost for a country still reeling from the Pearl Harbor attack and was Japan's first setback during the early days of the war.